So you have an EcoTank printer and chances are you've clicked on this video because your printer has stopped putting ink on the paper. Most likely because most of the ink is missing, or worse, everything is just completely blank. And you've probably assumed that the print head is just clogged up or blocked, right? Well, yeah, you and almost everyone else in this situation. The reality is that whilst that could be the problem, there's a lot of other things that it could be too, which is where this video comes in. But before we jump straight to the solutions, no, don't worry. Not a message from our sponsor. I mean, we're the sponsor after all. First, I wanted to give you a quick introduction into what lies within an EcoTank printer and how that information will help you find a fix. EcoTank printers are really not a new concept or design. In reality, they're using something called a CIS, or a continuous ink supply system, like this. These systems have been around for over 20 years, and the only real difference in an EcoTank is that they have been built into the printer, which, as you'll see, can be good and bad. As you've doubtless heard, having a CIS system like this can provide some very positive benefits. The main one being that your print head is now fed from these large ink reservoirs instead of those expensive and relatively small cartridges. The way a CIS system works is pretty simple. As your printer prints, ink droplets are pushed out of the print head nozzles, creating a negative pressure which then draws more ink from the reservoirs to replace what's being used. That in turn pulls air into the reservoir to replace it. Now, in an EcoTank printer, your CIS system is, as we said, built in. So your printer may suffer from normal CIS issues, but addressing them may be harder because of the design. After all, these printers are created to make them easier to manufacture, to stop you from doing something potentially messy, and also protect the manufacturer's profits. What they've not been designed to do is to make it easy for you to service them. Now, none of these issues are insurmountable, but they do make things a bit more interesting. Anyway, with that general introduction out of the way, let's start going through what can cause problems, how to identify the issues, and then how to deal with them. So common causes. Well, let's start at the beginning. The reservoirs. Have you actually checked the ink levels in the ink reservoirs? I know, it sounds like a really dumb thing to miss, but it does happen. So before you do anything else, look at the reservoirs and make sure you can see ink in each of the reservoir chambers. You should also make sure that the ink level is above the minimum mark indicated here. Now, if you've just realised that you let the ink run out on one or more of your ink channels, you may be able to fix things quite easily by running something called a power clean. First though, you must make sure that you've topped up your ink reservoirs so they are at least half full. Once you're ready, turn off your printer, then press and hold the question button before pressing the power button. You then follow the on-screen instructions. If you have a printer like this one that doesn't have an LCD display, you can still run a power clean, but you need to do it from your computer via your printer's printing preferences and maintenance tab. Just to note, you may be shown a number of warnings about potential damage to your printer, etc. The main reason for these warnings is because a power clean will waste a lot of ink. Now, critical point. If you're already aware of the power clean fix and have tried using it recently, then we wouldn't recommend running it again, as it's likely your printer is suffering from one of the other problems that I'm about to highlight in this video. And frankly, you'd just be wasting more ink. Oh, and if you hit the waste ink pad error, click on the link above to find out how to solve that problem too. Next up, we have the age of your ink. Ink age can result in clumps of material clogging up your print head, or the filter, if you have one, in the dampers. But how it happens depends on your ink type. Dye inks can suffer from biological growth like algae, as the ink's biocide or inhibitor slowly becomes less effective. Usually this is when the ink is 2 or more years old, but it can vary depending on the environment your printer is located in. Quick tip, heat and direct sunlight will advance the age of your ink quite significantly. Pigment inks, on the other hand, don't encourage biological growth, but the pigment particles can over time settle or clump together depending on how the ink is manufactured. So you need to make sure the inks stay mixed and in solution. In both cases, when you get clumps, this is what clogs things up. Finally, you can also create the clumping or clogging problem if you mix incompatible inks. Different ink recipes can and do use different chemical components that sometimes react poorly with each other. So where possible, it's best to stick to one brand and type of ink rather than just buying whatever cheap stuff you can find from whatever supplier. Moving on, we come to the dampers. Also known as buffers, these dampers are the ink containers that sit where you would traditionally see cartridges in your printer. As you can see, they contain a relatively small amount of ink, and they are fed via the tubing from the reservoirs, ultimately delivering the ink to the printhead. The reason they are called a damper or buffer is because they help absorb the small but significant changes in pressure as the printhead moves back and forth while printing. Ironically enough, a small amount of air is key here, but you don't want too much. The problem with these is that they can, over time, fill with air rather than ink. This can be caused by leaky seals in the outlet at the base of the buffer, ink levels in the reservoir dropping below the minimum mark, resulting in air being drawn into the system, or leaks somewhere in the reservoir or buffer path. One additional feature of dampers is that they can sometimes include a filter mesh internally. That's there to help stop clumps of dust, algae or pigment ink reaching the printhead, but if that's clogged, ink flow will be slowed or it just won't reach the printhead at all. So that's an overview of what might be causing problems. Now you need to know how to diagnose your printer's particular problem or problems. As we'll show, access to the dampers is one of the key ways to diagnose the bulk of issues. So you're going to need to know how to do that for your specific printer. Now apologies, but this video is not going to cover the disassembly process as there's just too many different designs and it would just make this video ridiculously long. What we will do is our best to provide a playlist of short guides for those models that we have access to, and we'll try to add to that as time allows. However, rather than forcing you to wait for us, here's some tips on how to find the information you need yourself. First off, Epson reuses the same design across multiple different model references, so it's always a good idea to identify other printer models similar to yours. To use this ET2711 as an example, it's the same as the ET2710 and the L3150. So you may not be able to find a disassembly guide specific to the ET2711, but you might find something for the ET2710, L3150 or similar instead. So to maximize your chances of finding what you need, try the following. Do a web search on Google or Bing or whatever search engine you prefer using with these keywords. Your printer model, so in this case an ET2711, and then keywords service and manual. This will usually turn up a screenshot of, or sometimes the actual service manual itself, that covers your printer and lists others that are the same basic design. So your ET2711 here turns out to be very similar to all these other printers. Next, let's use that information to try finding a disassembly video or guide. Again, you're using a web search with keyword variations on teardown or disassembly, fix, along with your printer model. And remember, you can try the same search but with one of the other printer model references that you found in your earlier step. And yes, you do need to get a little creative with your keywords, but once you've found some likely resources, you can then compare the video and image results against your actual printer and see if they will help you to access your printer's internals and get to the dampers. Keep trying with this approach until you find what you need. Oh, and if you are successful, please post the keywords, model references, etc. that you found helped you in the comments below, obviously with your particular printer model reference. But please, no unrelated promo links or spam. We will be moderating the comments queue. Now that you've found how to get in and access the internal parts of your printer, it's time to diagnose the actual problem. The most obvious thing to look for is any sign of ink leakage. If there are obvious puddles of ink under the tubing or in the print head carriage, then that indicates that you have a puncture, broken connection point, or similar somewhere in the system. Diagnosing that sort of problem is usually relatively simple and mostly a case of identifying where the ink is pooling before tracing back to find the hole. The most common puncture or failure points are the plastic film on the dampers or ends of the tubing where it connects to the damper or the reservoir. Of course, if you have kids and one of them's gotten into the printer with a pair of scissors, that might be a little obvious too. Assuming that potential punctures or ink leaks have been ruled out, we then start focusing on the dampers, as this is where most of the problems occur. If you can see a filter in the damper, then check for any signs of clogging or foreign material, gunk, etc., that might be clogging it up. Next, carefully check the condition of the rubber seal around the damper outlet. You may not be able to see any damage, but if there is any, or if the seal is completely missing, you'll need to replace the damper, which we'll cover later. Oh, and whatever you do, do not remove the plastic film that holds the rubber seal in place. For the next step, you're going to need some tools. This simple kit is something we've relied on for decades now, and it's just a syringe with an adapter that fits perfectly into the damper outlet and pushes open the poppet valve inside. If you're looking at creating something with what you have to hand, you'll need a syringe and something like a tapered needle with a small V-notch in the tip to allow air and ink to be sucked into the syringe. The key is that you need to have something that will allow you to pull ink through the outlet in the damper without damaging or overly stretching the outlet's rubber seal. Now, this video isn't intended as a sales vehicle for the kit, but it really does make this process a whole lot simpler. So for anyone who is interested in buying it, please check the description below or the link above. Okay, assuming you now have suitable tools, we could do the following. First thing we need to do is check for any resistance. Using the syringe and adapter, try pulling any ink through the damper outlet to check for any resistance. If you can feel resistance while pulling back, and if the syringe plunger returns to the same resting position that it started from, then something is stopping the ink from flowing. To further identify where the blockage is located, carefully disconnect the damper from the tubing and try pulling ink through the damper on its own, and then, if necessary, the open end of the tubing. Quick tip: if you decide to try pushing ink or air through the damper, check where you're aiming the open end of the damper, as a sudden release of ink could result in a critical need to redecorate. If the tubing has resistance, then it's highly likely that you have some sort of clumped up material in the reservoir. Gently pushing air into the tubing may help push the material out and back into the reservoir. Quick tip number 2. Whatever you do, do not push air or ink into the tubing and then allow the tubing to push itself off the syringe. The sudden release of pressure in the tube will result in air and ink flying out. You won't look good as a rainbow. Trust me, I've learned this the hard way. I wasn't going to do that. Always make sure you release and equalize any pressure by drawing back on the syringe to its starting point before you disconnect it from the tubing. Now, I did that so that you wouldn't, hopefully. At this point, if you have resistance in one or more parts, you should be able to determine if a damper, tubing, or a reservoir are clogged, and need to be cleaned out or even replaced. As mentioned earlier, air should only be getting into the reservoir via its own vent. You want ink to flow to the print head, not air. And because ink is heavier and harder to move, any air leak in the CIS system means that the ink stays in the reservoir while the air takes its place, slowly filling the tubing, the damper, and eventually the print head instead. So the next task is to test for any air leaks. It's worth noting that if your tubing or damper has a hole in it sufficient to let ink out, chances are you've already seen a small puddle or similar either under the printer or in the area where the ink tubing and print head are located. And if you were paying attention while checking for resistance, you will have caught some ink spray coming out of the leak. Often though, you'll find that an air leak is small enough or located in a way that there's no visible clue. The biggest indicator is if your damper is mostly or even completely full of air. That usually indicates that your damper has either a hole in the clear plastic membrane or the rubber seal in the outlet has perished. If either of those is obvious, you need to replace the damper. Please note, your damper does need a small amount of air inside to work properly. So you want at least 50% or half full of ink. Unfortunately, sometimes the leak is sneaky and isn't immediately obvious. So here's what you can do to not only test for it, but also reprime the system. Before I start, this process is the same used to reprime a damper. So if you've allowed your ink level to drop below the minimum line, this is the same process you can use to solve that problem. So using our syringe and adapter, we suck air out of the damper and pull ink into it until it's roughly 80% or 4/5 full with ink, like this. It's important to leave a small amount of air in the damper, as that's what helps attenuate any pressure changes when the print head is moving back and forth. Once we're done, we then reinstall the damper in the print head and repeat for each of the other ink lines until they're all re-primed. Obviously cleaning your kit between each repriming. You then put everything back together as before and try using the printer as normal. A single print head clean may be necessary to prime the print head itself, but please don't do multiple print head cleans, and definitely no power cleans. You need to let any air bubbles or foam in the nozzles disperse, as they can give the false impression of a clog when really they're only temporary. At this point, it's a case of allowing 24 hours and doing a few test prints to see if the issue has resolved itself. If there's still a slow air leak somewhere, you'll see gaps in the nozzle check that get worse over time. And if needed, you can confirm by accessing the dampers again to check the volume of air in them. If the air volume has increased markedly, it may be time to replace the damper. If, however, the dampers remain filled to roughly the same volume, you may find that the printer has just ingested a bunch of air due to ink level dropping too far or bubbles building up in the system over time. Either way, knowing how to reprime dampers is one of the fixes we recommend, so it's well worth knowing how to do it. As mentioned a number of times, you may need to consider replacing one or more of the dampers. You can source these from a number of places, and I'll put some suggestions in the description below. There are different designs though, so make sure you get the one for your printer or it won't fit. The process for replacing a damper is really quite simple though. You'll want gloves on and plenty of absorbent material in and around your work area to catch any mess. Once you're ready, carefully pull the old damper off the tubing, orient the new damper with the tubing so it won't twist once installed, and then push the damper's inlet bulb into the tubing's open end. Once that's done, you reprime the damper using the process demonstrated earlier. This next issue doesn't affect all EcoTank models, but if the problem is just being caused by the internal filter, you may be able to flush out the problem with printhead cleaning solution, or just a bit of pressure via the damper outlet using the syringe and adapter tool. But again, be careful where you're pointing the inlet nozzle so you don't spray ink and solution everywhere. As a secondary point, if your filter was clogged, you'll also want to replace the ink with a new supply, or you'll just end up with the exact same problem all over again. As noted earlier, there are some tasks that are a lot harder to complete because the EcoTank CIS system is built into the printer. Replacing the ink is another such task. For starters, the keyed filling port makes it very difficult to get any ink out of the reservoir, so you have to get creative. If you're lucky and the ink is not clumping, you can draw any ink from the reservoir out through the damper end of your tubing. You just plug your syringe and the adapter into the open end and suck the ink out, dumping the ink into a suitable container for later disposal. If your ink was contaminated, the wrong ink was put in by mistake, or the ink is clumping, then it's worth flushing your reservoir with some cleaning solution to remove any crud or anything else that's been left behind. But to get into the reservoir, you'll need an old ink bottle with the keyed cap. Of course, you could modify the reservoir for more direct access, but make sure you have a way to plug the hole afterwards. You'll also need to move the printer around so that the solution washes around inside the reservoir, like this. Once you're happy you've succeeded in cleaning everything, you then suck out the mixture of cleaning solution and ink as before. Repeat this stage, but this time use distilled or deionized water to rinse out any remaining cleaning solution, and you need to do this 2, 3, possibly more times to get all of the cleaning solution and any remaining ink out. The penultimate step is to use a small amount of your new ink supply to dilute and remove the last remnants of any water in the system. Put approximately 10 to 20 milliliters of the correct ink into the reservoir. Really sluice the ink water mixture around as much as possible to ensure that any droplets of any non-ink fluids are absorbed into the mix. And then when you're happy, suck the ink mixture out again using the syringe and then dispose of it, get rid of it as before. Once you're happy you've removed as much of the liquid as possible, just refill your reservoir as normal. Oh, and make sure you're putting the correct ink in. The rest is about reconnecting your damper and repriming the damper with ink, as we showed you before. So that's most of the issues that can make it look like your printhead is clogged. But what about if your printhead really is clogged up and needs cleaning? Well, you've already gained access to the ink receivers that your dampers connect to, and most printhead cleaning instructions recommend injecting cleaning solution into those ink receivers. However, before you go to the active printhead cleaning route and forcing anything into the printhead, it's worth trying a more passive approach first, using a small folded piece of kitchen towel placed on the capping station. And then leaving the printhead located over it. In this position, the cleaning solution is usually drawn upwards into the nozzles where it can break down clumps of dried ink or biologicals. It's a bit like putting your dishes into warm soapy water and letting the heat and detergent break down dried food so you don't have to scrub. You do need to be careful doing this though, particularly if you're going to use an active cleaning technique where positive pressure is used. If you use too much pressure, you can delaminate your printhead, i.e. the pressure can find alternative easier ways out through one of the laminated layers within the printhead. If that happens, it's game over for your printhead. So being gentle and patient is key to any kind of success. Now, the internet and YouTube have lots and lots of guides showing various ways that you can clean your print head. So I'm not going to recreate all of them here in detail, but what I've just shown you should give you an overview. One more related item. You may already be aware of this, but trying to troubleshoot issues in EcoTank printers usually generates a lot of waste ink. That in turn can result in your printer throwing up an error about the waste ink pads needing to be replaced. For some newer printers, you'll have something called a maintenance box, but most earlier models, like this one, did not. If that's you, please don't panic. Don't assume that this means game over. Octo Inkjet, which is us, have been dealing with these waste ink issues for the last 20 years. So please check this YouTube channel for more info on what you can do to fix that problem. Oh, and please ignore Epsom support if their immediate response is to buy a new printer. Feel free to comment below or contact us directly at support@octoink.co.uk if you need more information or links to the resources for your particular printer model. We'll be happy to help. Now, just to finish things up, the internet is littered with owners of EcoTank printers like yourself who appear to be going through the grief process, many at the anger phase, whilst others have all but lost hope in the future of their printer. But I really do trust that this video has given you back some of that hope, along with a bigger clue on how to diagnose a number of common EcoTank printer problems and then be able to fix them. Also, just to note, this video channel isn't intended to be a static resource, and we do plan to provide updates as well as improvements wherever we can. Where we've got updated fixes, you'll catch little links like this one that indicate an improved resource or guide at some point in the video, assuming of course there is any when you actually watch this. Also, don't forget to check the description and any pinned comments for links to any updates, quick tips or similar. Oh, and please, if you have some hard-won tips of your own regarding this particular topic, please do share them in the comments. We're always willing to learn from the mistakes and hard-won lessons of other users, like yourself. So, the key takeaway is that your printer can usually be resurrected with a little patience, time, and a few tools. Oh, and please remember, prevention is better than cure. So make sure you use your printer regularly and top up your ink reservoirs before any of them get too low. Anyway, thanks for watching. Maybe see you in the next one. Bye bye.